for joining us on this monthly Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction event as part of our UCL work on climate change. So today we're going to be focusing on the road to COP29 in Baku, tackling the climate crisis. So my name is Susannah Fisher, and I'm a Principal Research Fellow at UCL in the department. And I'm really excited to welcome a brilliant panel today to talk about some of these issues. Just to let you know, we will be recording the session today for our use. So to let you know, that will be going on. So how we're going to focus today is we're going to have a fairly informal discussion between our experts, talking about some of the main issues that are going to be coming up in a few weeks' time. And then we're going to hopefully have time at the end to hear from your questions. It's a chat function that we'll be using. So if you have questions as they come up towards the end, please do put them in the chat. And we'll also be monitoring the chat. So if there are things coming up that you're not sure about, questions that you'd like to ask, acronyms you're unsure about, just put those down in the chat and we'll try and respond to that as we go along. I think we've got a broad audience today. So we're really delighted to welcome some of our master's students from UCL, as well as a wider audience. So we're trying to speak both to those who are less familiar with the negotiations and also those who might have more experience. So to give you some context on the event, this is part of our risk and disaster reduction event series. We've got this one today, and we've got one coming up in November on leadership. So please do look at our broader event series. This is also part of wider climate change work at UCL. So we're really excited at UCL to be working on a cross-institutional initiative on our grand challenge of the climate crisis. And members of UCL will be going to COP29 soon as part of our delegation. This is also part of an initiative that I'm leading from the Department of Risk and Disaster Reduction, where we look at ideas of accountability and the politics of measurement in adaptation. So it brings together lots of streams of work across the institution. Now, before I turn us over to our brilliant panelists today, I wanted to give everyone a very high-level picture of the history of what we're talking about. So I think there are really three key areas that will come up across our conversations today that are, of course, building on negotiations that have been going on for decades. So the first area is the critical one we think of as mitigation. So reducing emissions and how we transition away from fossil fuels. And for that conversation, we're in a really critical point as countries and governments are thinking about how will they ratchet up their ambition for the next phase of national contributions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And Baku is a really crucial step on that pathway to ratcheting up ambition. Secondly, we have an issue which will be a big focus for all of our panelists today on bringing the money in to allow that transition to happen. So back in 2009, developed countries promised 100 billion a year to help countries transition their economies away from fossil fuels and to respond to the impacts of climate change. But the big question that's coming up now that others will talk about in much more detail is what happens next, because that number was set until 2025, and now we need to set something new. And the third area of really important negotiations coming up is how we're managing the impacts of climate change. So these conversations have been going on for many, many years, but in 2015, a particular conversation was started around the global goal on adaptation. And more recently, we've been talking about something called a loss and damage fund. So it's a very long history to what's going to be discussed in Baku, and our panelists will try and bring out some of that nuance for you. And I think one can't continue in a climate change webinar without saying, of course, the broader context is that in just this year, we have seen impacts across the world that are already affecting people and communities and countries. So we've seen the hurricanes in the US, Milton and Helene. We've seen the terrible floods in Central Europe, seen wildfires in Brazil cutting through a tropical wetland, and we've seen heat waves across South and Southeast Asia and many other extreme events. And we know now with the advances in rapid attribution science that these events are all made more likely or more severe because of climate change. So the overall context of these political negotiations is huge urgency to take action. So now I'd like to introduce my three panelists for today. So we have with us Binyam Gebreyes, who's a principal researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. Binyam leads on climate diplomacy at the IIED and is head of governance for something called the Least Developed Countries Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. We also have Laetitia Pettinotti, So Laetitia works at the Overseas Development Institute. She's a climate economist and has previously worked with the C40 and London School of Economics. And we have Demet İntepe, who's the climate adaptation and resilience expert at Practical Action, which is an international NGO. And she also leads or co-chairs the Climate Action Network UK Adaptation Working Group and the Women and Gender Constituency Working Group. So lots of experience across the panel, both working directly as negotiators, with negotiators, technical inputs and civil society behind the scenes. So hopefully we're going to be able to get into some of that detail. So what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my slides so we can really see everyone here together. And what I've asked everyone to do is to start by thinking about their top 3 points for what do we really want to get out of COP29. So I'm going to start over to you, Binyam. What does success looks like for you? What can we hope to be saying after this is all over?
Thanks very much, and I'm very happy to be here today to speak about COP29 expectations. We're a few weeks away, so a lot of momentum being built around that, and I've been putting some thought into what I'll be saying today, and I think we need to go beyond the specifics line by line negotiation to the overall thinking on what we need to deliver from COP. And my first point will be looking at the geopolitics and the tensions and all the multilateral process. I think this is a high time for COP to send a strong message about revitalizing multilateralism. I believe multilateralism is at stake because there is a huge erosion of trust, whether finance is going to be delivered, whether mitigation action is being met, whether there is transparency, accountability. So there is a lot of risk around that eroding trust. And I think COP29 is a very high time for parties and non-parties to send a very strong signal to the world around multilateralism. And my second point is linked to kind of the earlier one, but it needs to also bring more clarity to the purpose on why we're doing this. And I think you highlighted the key points in your presentation earlier about why we're doing this. It is mitigation, it is adaptation, and addressing loss and damage, and having the core means of implementation to support that. And I think a lot of divergence from this core goal is eroding trust as well. So I think COP29 needs to also really pull parties and non-parties into a common vision and goal. And I guess the last one is we all talk about deliverables in this process, and I think the terminology is mandate, and I think there is huge expectation from Baku to deliver on finance, and that delivery shouldn't be watered down or shouldn't be postponed for later date, because beyond the climate world, the whole world is watching, the whole world is expecting delivery. So we need to make sure that this COP is a COP that delivers on the promises it has made, the promises on delivering finance, assuring that money is there, assuring that money will be delivered. So I'll come into the details in a bit, but those would be my higher level expectations for COP.
Brilliant, Binyam. Thank you. So over to you, Laetitia. What would success look like for you?
Thank you, Susannah, and thank you to UCL for organizing this very interesting panel. I guess following on what Binyam was saying, and I fully agree with this analysis that for multilateralism, this is a crunching point. There is so much distrust, and a lot of it has crystallized around climate finance, right? Because as you were mentioning, Susannah, the 100 billion was agreed in 2009, was supposed to be met by 2020. 2 years later, it was actually met. So there is a lot of distrust, resentment, and how do we get to overcome this? So I guess in terms of what would success look like, there is a lot of pressure for what would be a successful new climate finance goal. So for that to be a successful new climate finance goal, I think actually a lot of it has already been defined in the Paris Agreement, because at the moment that's something that comes up a lot in different events, but also in the press, about what would be an ambitious new climate finance goal. And I'm sure, Binyam, you're representing also a certain set of countries. I come from more of a research background, so I guess my thought was, well, what would ambition would look like? If I go back to the Paris Agreement, actually there we do say already, so back in 2015, what climate finance goal is for, and that is to accelerate the achievement of the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. And it's written there in the sense that in Article 2, we do state what are the 3 long-term goals, and one is temperature target, so well below 2 degrees. Another one is about adaptation, and the third one is about climate consistency of all flows. So to the question, what would success look like? What would ambition look like specifically for the climate finance goal? I think we have to think of it in the sense of, does what is agreed, the decision text, the negotiations, does it help us accelerate these goals, the 3 goals that are contained in the Paris Agreement? How much do they help us progress onto achieving those goals? And that can be our, let's say, analytical grid to understand what is on the table and whether it does help us, match that path that we have charted to ourselves. So to me, that would be this, what would success look like, is actually how much on track are we to meet these goals that we have outlined in the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thanks. And so over to you, Demet. So bringing more of a civil society perspective and less maybe on the finance, like what would success look to you in some of these other areas?
Thanks, Susannah. Hi, everyone. I will actually tie my comments back to the finance piece, because as you know, we're going into this finance COP this year.
Always comes back to money.
Everything goes back to money. So, I mean, thank you very much for this, because we all know that the UNFCCC is by design in its origins very much about mitigation, how we stop the greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a huge part of that that's also about adaptation and loss and damage. So how do we reduce the harm or the risk that climate change causes to people, communities, ecosystems? And then what are the negative impacts that go beyond what people can adapt to, and causing losses and damages to people, to lives, livelihoods, well-being, systems, infrastructures, and everything. So what I want to emphasize, first of all, before I go to what success looks like, is that loss and damage in the recent years has had a rather higher profile politically. But I want to emphasize that adaptation, both adaptation and loss and damage, are inherently climate justice issues, because we see the communities around the world who have produced so far the lowest level of emissions experiencing those, first and worst impacts of climate change. So that continuum of mitigation. So if we don't mitigate, we have to adapt. If we don't adapt, we go into loss and damage. That continuum is very important to emphasize. And unfortunately, we see this, despite all the knowledge that's out there with the negotiators, parties, experts, everyone who's contributing to that process, we still don't see this balance. So with this picture in mind, I will, my 3 key areas will be, first of all, my focus personally is very much on adaptation. So I would say elevating adaptation in the climate change agenda, because adaptation is often treated as a technical issue, and it's often relegated to climate sciences, social sciences, but it's also a political issue, and it's of utmost urgency at the moment. So under the climate change negotiations, we want adaptation to have equal weight with mitigation, and that's absolutely not the case right now. It needs that political elevation, because climate impacts are global. I mean, we're seeing the impacts everywhere. Extreme heat, droughts, in the UK, in the US, Bangladesh, Mozambique, everywhere you go. So there's nowhere safe right now anymore. So that will be my first point, elevating the state of adaptation under the negotiations. And secondly, then I will bring it to finance now. That political elevation needs to be backed up by finance that's going towards the most vulnerable of the world, so that they can adapt to a new reality and address their losses and damages. Because the finance that's flowing right now is far from adequate, and for the adaptation and loss and damage, specifically within the finance piece, we want to see thematic sub-goals. What that means is that we would like to see amounts separately pledged for mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage, because we want to see those clear pledges accompanied by tracking mechanisms to ensure that accountability for how those finance allocations are delivered. And finally, I will say the third very important point from my perspective is under adaptation and loss and damage, supporting local level climate action with the full integration of gender, youth, disability rights, human rights, local and indigenous people's rights. These should be cross-cutting in all considerations, in all deliberations, and they should translate into tangible policy and implementation efforts as well. We need to go beyond this very tokenistic inclusion of these components and really discuss the way to meaningfully integrate these. So these three areas, the elevation of politically backed up by finance and the meaningful integration of local rights and gender and all the other issues will be my three areas of focus.
Great, thanks, Demet. So I'm hearing from all of you that there's a lot on the table, that it's a kind of a crunch time in many ways, but across everyone, we're also talking about what money is kind of underpinning this. So I'm just going to go to Binyam to ask him to fill us in a little bit more on what are underlying these finance conversations. And I should say that, you know, I know from Binyam's social media feed that people don't just go to Baku and kind of pick up the negotiations. There's been a whole lot of technical workshops with everyone who will be there already. So there's years of work that Binyam and others have been involved in to get these issues even to the Conference of Parties. So Binyam, we'd love to hear more.
Thanks. Yeah, it's going to be a difficult task to put that 3 years plus discussion in 5 minutes. But I just to kind of hook to what Laetitia mentioned earlier. We've agreed on principles, we've agreed on goals, and we have a guide to where it needs to take us. But of course, linking back to the multilateralism question, sometimes it becomes about interpreting, right? Just to leave their commitment or drop commitment, some might interpret it in the wrong way. So I think what should have been a very easy replacement of the 100 billion with what we've learned over time, it now became such a political discussion about a lot of things, and even the terminology NCQG is a negotiated term. It's to that level that parties try to put in their interest and their position. So it's new has its own meaning, collective has its own meaning, quantified has its meaning, and the goal. Why is it a goal? Is it a target? Is it just a figure? So all of that is very negotiated. So basically, the new collective quantified goal is there to replace the 100 billion. Our learning and what we've agreed in Paris is guiding us to setting a new target or a new goal. And with that, parties have been bringing a lot of issues. Non-state actors, research organizations, academia, they've been bringing a lot of issues to the table to discuss under the technical expert dialogue over a period of now nearly 3 years to bring all these ideas. And we've talked about private sector. We even have gone into the level of, can we have a figure that's specific to each sector? For example, on energy, on water. We even went to that length, but the conversations were quite diverse, and now they're kind of narrowing them down. So these technical expert dialogues have now moved into negotiation, and the work has been completed, and the co-facilitators have produced a text. And this will have two fronts, a political and a technical negotiation. So the first week and plus would be dedicated to technical negotiators to iron out details of what they could potentially agree on. And then whatever is remaining goes to politicians. So there is slight chance for agreeing on a few things. But big ticket items for me would be one, the figure, or if you want to sound fancy, we call it the quantum. So the figure, what's going to be the figure? That's the main issue. And the figure, there are 1.1 trillion, 1 trillion, floor from 100 billion is being tabled. So for me, that could potentially be a politician's decision to say this is the final figure. But now there is also another conversation about layers. Where does the source come from? Is it from public? Is it from private? Is it mobilized? Or is it just a provision from the government pot to developing countries? The thematic areas, are we going to have specific allocation for adaptation, mitigation, and loss and damage? Or are we even going to talk about loss and damage? Are we going to expand on the contributor base? Would it be the old list that would be used for commitment, or do we add new countries into the list to contribute to the pool? And allocation for LDCs and SIDS, and even within the developed countries, how do they share the burden? Is it an equal split? How will there be a burden sharing? So there are a lot of items that would need to be resolved. And the biggest risk I would like to highlight is when it goes to the political level, they decide only on the few big items. So which could likely water down the outcome of COP or move it to next year's for discussion. So my worry is in that regard. So part of my expectation for delivery is it needs to fix all this, because these are the learnings that informed us to bring this issue. So I will leave it there.
Great. Okay, thanks. So I'm going to just swiftly, while we're kind of in the more detailed section, ask Laetitia to pick up on some of those points with the work they've been doing at ODI, which is really fascinating on kind of what's a fair share of money for people to contribute.
Yeah, well, Binyam, you gave us a whirlwind tour of everything that is currently getting discussed, which makes my job really easy in the sense that I would like to discuss one specific point in there that's still, pulling the thread of what is ambition. So Binyam, you were talking about a potential burden sharing arrangement in the sense that it would be a mechanism that allocates how much money each developed country, which is responsible for providing climate finance under the new goal, how much each individual country, developed country, would be providing. So that's what we call the fair share report. So let me share, because we have quite a few numbers that I wanted to share. So let me share my screen, and it should be working. Is that right?
Yes, we see you.
Wonderful. So we call it the fair share of climate finance in the sense that this goal is a collective, and that's a bit of the issue in a way, is that it's very easy to hide behind each other. So for countries to say, well, I provided X billion, so the gap that we see is not my fault. So what I'm going to present is based on research that we've done, so with my colleague Tony and Sarah at ODI, and perhaps Aisha can put the link to the full report in the chat, because this is just one specific point that I'm going to present. If I can move the slide, yes. So why is this idea of a burden sharing, and why is this idea of a fair share? As I was saying, so the 100 billion was a collective of developed countries together collectively are to provide that amount of money. So if we take that learning, as Binyam was saying, we have been learning a lot. If we take that learning into the new goal, then that means that having a burden sharing arrangement where we can say, well, France, I'm from France, so I pick on France. France is in charge of providing X billion, while the US is in charge of providing no. And that would be very ambitious, because that would tie down individual countries, right? Rather than having this, vague collective, that means each country could be pinned down for, in terms of accountability, it means you have a very definite figure, and then you can very much, evaluate their progress towards their fair share. And the other point, which we can see in the number, is that it also helps us to actually unpack the common but differentiated responsibility principle that is at the heart of the convention, in the sense that it also helps us having a more nuanced discussion about responsibility among developed countries, because developed countries are hugely heterogeneous and very different. So burden sharing actually, and the point here is not so much the text, but just to say that it's not something new. It's been in the convention in relation to financial instruments, in relation to funding since 92, again in 2001. So what I'm suggesting here, that others have suggested in their submissions, many countries are actually in support of this, like China, Group SUR, AOSIS, which is small developing islands, LMDCs, I'm sorry about all the acronyms, but just to say that there is a huge support for this type of arrangement, and it is nothing new. So what we are suggesting in our research is just one example of what it could look like. So we don't want to be prescriptive. Obviously, everything should be negotiated, because this is where, as you were saying, Binyam, like the technical becomes political. Choosing one indicator over another has huge implications. But basically, we have developed this index that's based on historic emissions, capacity to pay, and population, because we say that each person living in a developed country has equal responsibility. And so we come up with this index. So you can apply this to whatever target is finally agreed. So, if we go, for example, 1.3 trillion, as has been proposed by certain parties, that means that the US would be in charge of 45%, because among the highest polluters. But then Iceland, at the other end of the spectrum, is in the 0.04. So that was the heterogeneity I was talking about, right? If we apply this, so just to pull the thread a bit further to finance that was provided in 22, these are the results. So again, this tool for accountability, right? So what we see here is that actually about half of developed countries didn't provide their fair share in 22. And these are all the top ones. Of course, different countries have different responsibilities. So we can look at Greece and Portugal. Greece is at the very bottom, but in absolute numbers, they are not really the one that should pull their weight to meet the target. Actually, it's the US. They should have provided 30 billion more. Australia, about 1.6 billion more. And these are countries that you're seeing now that should have provided about 1 billion more. So this, again, this is a tool to actually be able, rather than having this like sort of grouped collective of like developed countries need to step up. Yes, but here we can advocate for which one should really step up. And of course, there is some good news, right? Some did provide their fair share, although this is like, 2 years later than the goal should have been. And some even twice as much. So, to conclude, this is really about like providing the tools for transparency, for accountability, and taking in the learning that we've had from the 100 billion into this new goal. So I'll stop here.
Great. Thanks, Laetitia. It opens obviously a lot of political opportunities and questions when targets countries like that, which of course is not always been the approach to build alliances. So it'd be interesting to discuss more as we go on, kind of how effective those kind of tools might be in these negotiations. But I just want to go now to Demet, to ask Demet, that beyond the kind of finance questions, let's see, adaptation and impacts more than just finance. It's about how do we raise ambition? How do we support people in the loss and damage? So what are we expecting to see in those areas at Baku?
Yeah, thanks, Susannah. So yeah, under adaptation, we're going to observe multiple strands of negotiations. But I would say the most important strand among these is the agenda item that's called the Global Goal on Adaptation. There are other names as well. I won't go into that for the specific agenda item, but broadly it's under the Global Goal on Adaptation. So I will explain that in a minute for those who might not be familiar with this. But so the issue with adaptation is that while it's extremely urgent, it's also very difficult to measure at a global scale. So it's very difficult to quantify and demonstrate how people adapt to a rapidly changing environment in very different parts of the world. There are so many different geographical contexts, cultural, political, ecological landscapes. There are different regulatory environments, financial gaps and needs, indeed. So this is why we always say adaptation is bound to the local context, right? So while we see mitigation efforts, they can be measured by tracking and quantifying greenhouse gas emissions. So there are some universal methodologies available, but for adaptation, there isn't a single set of metrics or indicators that can sufficiently measure the variety of adaptation actions across the world. So back to the global goal on adaptation, this is supposed to be basically a framework that will be used to track progress on the state of adaptation across the world. But like I said, there are a lot of methodological challenges due to the contextual and qualitative nature of adaptation, meaning it's not possible to capture adaptation by numbers alone. So even when we manage to come up with methodologies, then developing countries face huge challenges in implementing adaptation actions and are collecting data from those actions, especially in the absence of financial support. So, so at this COP, this global measurement framework, the details of that, working out the details, the specific indicators for that measurement framework will be a major issue, and it will go on in next year in the Bonn session, which happens in June, and it will hopefully conclude at COP30. But that's going to be an ongoing issue in the next year as well. So this year, negotiators will discuss how different adaptation actions can be measured under different sectors, for example, food, water, ecosystems, health, and so forth, which vary vastly across different geographical and political contexts. So that's one issue. Another major issue is going to be how to enable countries to implement adaptation actions. So when we talk about implementing measures on the ground, there are three crucial elements. The first one is, of course, finance. The second one is the transfer of technology to developing countries. And the third one is building developing countries' capacity. So these three elements are considered a package. I know we have experts in the room. They will know I'm talking about means of implementation. But there's disagreement between developed and developing countries currently on whether the adaptation goal should talk about this finance, technology, and capacity building needs. So developed countries say this should be discussed under the big finance piece and should have nothing to do with the adaptation piece. Developing countries and us as civil society, as practitioners, as advocates, we argue that there should be a way to track under this global goal what kind of support is flowing to countries that need it the most. So otherwise, if this is not included, how can you ask a country, especially with limited means, how can you ask them to set up physical infrastructure, install technology, coordinate national actors to work with each other, employ experts, set up data collection systems? How can all of this be achieved when there's no tracking and accountability for whether countries are receiving adequate support? So this will be the major issue. And under loss and damage is again the same. Back to the finance piece. Developing countries want to see loss and damage being included in the big finance target, and the various mechanisms under the loss and damage piece, which I won't go into now, those to be operationalized and certain arrangements finalized so that the finance can also start flowing to those who need it the most. So to summarize that commonality between the two, we would like to see adaptation being elevated this year, and both adaptation and loss and damage to be considered as distinct categories under the new finance goal. So these are very important. And I also want to say, I'm currently in Nepal, and Nepal is one of the 55 least developed countries in the world. And I'm not calling them least developed countries, it's one of the UN categorizations. And I've been talking to officials here from the Nepalese government. So they are saying that the amount they need to implement they came up with the adaptation actions they want to implement, they need to implement. The cost of this is $45 billion. whereas Nepal can only allocate 1.5 billion from their domestic sources. So that's how big the gap is. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Demet. Wow, you all have raised such huge issues in what's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour for everyone. So I hope people will be able to pick up those threads at these kind of massive issues running through that are really going to come to a head. Now, before we open out to questions, I also just wanted to ask each of our panelists to reflect a little bit for you on what it's actually like to be at these COPs and the different roles that they play, recognizing the different audiences that we have at this webinar. So I'm going to turn over to Binyam first, and hopefully we'll be able to show a few photos as well to kind of say, what's it like, a day in the life of being at COP for you?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm going to COP in a couple of days. So I'll be there for 3 weeks, which is never fun, away from family, and it's trying because we go to the LDC coordination meeting, then the African group, then G77, and by the end of those 3 coordination meetings, we have finished all the energy we have to start the meeting. But as a negotiator for Ethiopia and also support advisor for the LDC chair, our days are quite packed. We usually start our day 8 o'clock coordination meeting every day to touch base on where things are, and then we have lunch coordination to hear from our coordinators on the latest on each agenda item. And that's for the first week, but second week becomes more uncertain because it's usually ministers involved and a lot of presidency consultations. So a lot of waiting around, sometimes all-nighters. So little time for food, for water. So unless consciously factoring those in, it can sometimes take a toll on people's health, and we've seen people being affected by this. But it's a very busy, hectic process, and it's a lot of different individuals' contribution that creates that mosaic of art, as opposed to few individuals creating the big outcome. So I believe everyone plays a role, how big or small it is. Politicians do the sign off at the end, but it's a lot of effort that goes behind it. And I think all the contributions need to be factored in. Yeah.
Thanks, Binyam. Let's go over to Laetitia. So I think you play quite a different role in these negotiations. So I'd imagine your day-to-day is a little different. Perhaps you could talk us through what that's like.
Clearly have it easy compared to negotiators. But I think you're quite right, Binyam, in saying that it is in a way like a very physical, like rehydration packs are your friends, because basically the place is huge, and that's what you see on the left hand side of the slide. So that was last year COP. That's just, the blue zone, so all the green zone is not there. So a typical day for me would be waking up, having breakfast with my team to like dispatch like who is going where, because it's huge, and sometimes you just can't be like everywhere at the same time, so we dispatch. Then we try to get into rooms. We can't get into rooms most of the times because it's limited number of seating, there are loads of people, and we are a research center, so we don't have priority compared to people who, for example, are part of constituencies or even just parties negotiating. So then you end up listening virtually from the other side of the room. But with everything that happens at COP, that's listening what language is used. And that's what you were saying, Binyam, about like every term is negotiated. It's all a very performative discourse. So listening is mostly what you do, because then that's where, as Binyam was saying, negotiators are very busy. So for us on the research side, we're more, we're talking to other research centers, NGOs, we're talking to people who work with negotiators closely because they're part of their teams, etc. But COP are really the moment where you try to meet people to have these conversations about what are the implications of what has just been discussed during the day, right? We're really at the side of like, what are the implications? Because we would get text of like, have you heard this? What do you think? So a lot of it has been, years months before, so that you can be ready to answer that text that gets that you get on your phone. And so the last two pictures that you see is actually this, you know, you never know where you are, so you just spend a lot of time sending pictures to people saying, I'm by the white tree, or this round building that doesn't have any door. That's the one on the right. And I would say, encourage everyone to check the really excellent Earth Bulletin and Third World Network, which are like roundup of what happened the day before, and they're really excellent in, you know, doing a recap of whatever has been said. So I would really recommend these two resources.
Great, thanks, Laetitia. So then over to Demet, more of a civil society advocacy perspective. I'd imagine your days must look a bit different.
Yes, thanks. The COP is a huge event. So my first COP was COP26, and it was such a shock to the system. I was just spent quite some time trying to figure out what it's all about. Because over the years, apparently it evolved from just negotiations into this huge climate expo. So what Laetitia mentioned with the blue zone is where you go with a badge, and you have to be accredited to enter the blue zone. The green zone is for business, but the blue zone is where the negotiations take place. So we go to the blue zone, we're accredited via our organizations, and we go as observers. And you apply for a number of badges from your organization, and then you're allocated by the system a certain number so that you can go and represent your organization. And everyone's badges show who they are. They have different colors, so you can see who's an observer. It's yellow, party is pink, UN staff and diplomats, they all have different colors, so you can recognize people from a distance. Getting into negotiation rooms, so we observe the negotiations as civil society. Getting into the negotiation rooms can sometimes be very challenging. Sometimes there's a very big popular meeting, say the global goal, and everybody wants to be there who's working on adaptation, they want to go there, but we have to wait first. The parties will be given priority, they will go into the room, and then if there's space left, then observers will go in. Of course, we try to challenge those obstacles at every turn and make sure at least some of us can go into the room, because I think observers are, you know, the check mechanism where we're checking what's happening in the room, and we go into bilaterals with parties. We convey the civil society point of view to negotiators, and we ask them if they need any information from us, if we can support their work as well. So it's not just civil society demanding things kind of conversation, but it's a two-way communication where we try to understand their perspective and they try to understand us. So from the photos, you can see that there are also actions inside the blue zone by the civil society. So my organization is part of the Climate Action Network, which is the biggest. So there are constituencies accredited to the UNFCCC. So one constituency is the Climate Action Network, is the collection of 1,900 environmental NGOs. So that's the biggest constituency. And we're also a member of the Women and Gender constituency, which is smaller. But we ask for permission to do actions inside the venue. So you can see some of those there. The photo of the paper you see, ECO, is our daily publication from Climate Action Network. We try to keep it light and humorous, but bitter and biting and sarcastic to get our messages across. So we respond to daily events as they happen, and we immediately publish the next day to respond and give the civil society perspective. And the last photo you see is the fossil of the day is my favorite part of the COP. This is also organized by the Climate Action Network. So every day for 2 weeks, there's a ceremony at 6 o'clock at the same spot, designated spot in the venue. And the Fossil of the Day award is handed to one country who blocks some important progress that day in the negotiations. And one representative from the Climate Action Network, say from someone from that country, goes to the stage to accept the award, but it's not a nice award to receive. So it's but it's quite fun, and it kind of, it gets the message across, but also adds that light touch as we always try to do. So yeah, but aside from that, we also, if possible, deliver interventions in negotiations, often no time left for observers. But we also have pavilions and organize side events and have our daily meetings.
Brilliant. Thanks, Demet. So I feel like we've had a good flavor of what it's like to be either negotiating directly or being more of a research support or more of a kind of advocacy and pressuring from the outside role. So I'm going to move on now to the questions from the audience. So there's a few technical questions on finance that I think we should just address head on. So one is this question of the contributor base. So what is the role of the emerging economies and contributing to the fund? And for ODI, the question is, does your tool take these countries into account? But of course, there's also a political dimension about this, which it would be good to hear Binyam's reflections on. So let's just start with that. Shall we? Laetitia, could I hand over to you to start, and then I'll follow with Binyam?
Yeah. So let's start with historically, it is developed countries that are supposed to provide climate finance. So what the issue is, this is not defined. There is no definition of what a developed country is, and that's not just under the Climate Change Convention, but in other forums, it's the same. So in the UNFCCC, there is an Annex 2 list, which is industrialized country in 1992. So there is this question that has been brought up a lot by different parties of, so historically Annex 2 have been understood as the developed countries. And so since the world has changed since 92, there has been a lot of discussion as to, but what about China? What about other countries that have been emitting a lot? So we had a look at cumulative emissions since basically 92, so when the convention was adopted. So it's a political threshold rather than a accurate scientific one. But basically the countries that could start thinking about providing climate finance would be Qatar, would be Kuwait, UAE, and South Korea. And we have a whole section in our report, so I would really encourage you to have a look at how we, in terms of methodology. But the last point that I think is really important in this conversation is that actually a lot of developing countries are actually providing climate finance. It's just that it's not communicated, it's not reported. So this discussion around China, for example, that comes up a lot. Actually, China contributes a lot. And again, we have crunched the number and, they are actually quite on par with a lot of developed countries. So perhaps it's about reporting rather than about who should contribute.
Thanks, Laetitia. So that's the technical answer. Binyam, what is the politics to this? What would the least developed countries like to see around this issue?
I mean, I think, like I said earlier, we have principles that we've agreed already, and we also need to factor in polluter pays principle, historic responsibility, common and differentiated responsibilities, and all of that. But in this context, I think we have to understand that it's beyond climate. The contributor-based discussion is not a climate issue. It's a political issue that goes beyond climate. And I don't think it should be a blockage to what we're trying to achieve here. Again, goes back to the need to go back to the collective vision that we have in addressing the climate impacts through mitigation, adaptation, and addressing loss and damage. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks. And just a second associated finance question coming from Ilan Kelman is, I would probably paraphrase as thinking about the broader financial flows, which is also an area under the agreement. So Ilan is pointing out that really this focus on quite a small amount of money and the intense political negotiations about what is relatively small in terms of global financial flows and subsidies going in the wrong direction to subsidize things like fossil fuels or subsidizing, in fact, infrastructure that's increasing risk for people. And what role you think there is for the COP or this negotiation space to try and impact those wider financial flows. So Laetitia, is that something you feel you could briefly comment on?
Absolutely, and it's a really strong contradiction, and I'm sure Demet on the advocacy and activist side also, the fossil award is exactly about that, right? is that we're so focused on counting what goes towards climate action, which is great, but then we sort of like forget the whole picture, which is all the finance that's going towards less than positive climate action. And this is one of the goals, actually, is making all financial flows climate consistent. That's one of the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is a point for discussion in a parallel track to the new climate finance goal. So it is a very live topic. I don't know if others want to comment on that one, but it is crystallizing a lot of tension as well.
But Binyam or Demet, did you want to add on that?
Maybe briefly, I think it's in addition to potentially being a source, I think we also need to look at how does it get from like if subsidies can be rechanneled into becoming climate finance, the next set of question is then how do we ensure that they reach developing countries, how they reach LDCs, and they're channeled in a way that they can be accessible with less transaction cost. And reaches the local community where the priority action is needed. So it's a lot of sets of questions, but I guess it also links to the just transition discussion as well. What about fairness? Who should be the one reducing subsidies first? Should it be pressured on certain countries as opposed to others? So there are lots of, I think, equity questions in the mix as well.
Indeed. Okay, I want to take a bit of a broader question now. So Alex Mendoza Farias is asking you, what are your expectations, if any, about how the activities in the more participatory green zone can influence the negotiations and the conversations in the blue zone? So Demet, I'll probably look to you to start this off, and perhaps just for our audience, you could just give us a recap on the green zone and the blue zone so we're all aware of the access issues around those.
Yeah, definitely. So the blue zone is where all the important action takes place. I have to say, it's where the negotiations take place, and it's where what I mentioned as the kind of this expo part of COP, where all the pavilions are. The countries have pavilions where they showcase their country's work on climate change. There are sometimes private companies as well and constituencies. So everyone who's very much involved in the process can have a pavilion there. So like I said, for the blue zone, you need that accreditation, that special badge. To my knowledge, it's easier to get a badge for the green zone, and green zone is where all the business interest concentrates. So to go back to Alex's question, how can the green zone influence the negotiations? To be really honest, I never think about the green zone for 2 weeks. I think it really depends on what your interests are going to the COP. There are people who are very much interested in the green zone because that's the place where you make the connections, have the conversations, especially, like I said, for businesses, for innovators, to have those conversations. But the core of the conference takes place in the blue zone, and I don't see that kind of influence from the green zone to the blue zone.
Laetitia, you have your hand up.
I just wanted to add on the very practical, what Binyam was telling you is that, the day starts at 7, ends at like 2 a.m. And, an added layer is that sometimes the blue and green zone are actually quite far away from each other. It depends. But, in practical terms, it's not an easy, I'll just sidestep. And so it's very difficult. I guess your best friend is the press. If you really want to do an action or, relay through advocacy groups or can that Demet mentioned, but don't expect people to casually wander around the green zone because just time crunch.
Thanks. And I think we just have time for one more question. So I'm going to pick up a question from Brianna Kraft here, which is something we talked about briefly before we went online, that with the looming US election coming just before, or as she says, in the pre-sessional week, how do you think this might impact the negotiations? And perhaps, what kind of mitigation plans do your respective constituencies have in place for two quite different political directions of such a major player? Binyam, would you be able to start us with that one?
Yeah, it takes me back to the days at Marrakesh where we heard on I think the start of second week where Trump was elected, and we've seen a lot of like mood shift in the overall outcome. But I think there is a lesson in that. There is a lesson in how the world can and should navigate. The first is US is a critical player. We need all political approaches to ensure that US continues to engage and continues to be part of and commit responsibly. So that political element needs to happen, but we also need to at least ensure that the others that can contribute shouldn't backslide because of the US. So like the US, the others, the EU, and others like Japan and others, they shouldn't backslide because US has left. So again, the principle of multilateralism needs to be strengthened. And while there is a risk and unpredictable element of the US election, but whatever the outcome, parties are collectively trying to address it, this not being shouldered by one specific country. So I think it's a mix of reactions, I guess.
Thanks, Binyam. Would anyone else like to add in, Laetitia or Demet? No.
Perhaps a small of hope, if indeed there is a Trump re-election. That last time what we saw is that actually we had a lot of action that were local, lots of cities, for example. Maybe that's my background at C40, but which is a climate action, a city-led network. A lot of cities in the US said, well, we're still doing it. So it also had that pendulum swing where a lot of people actually got galvanized by this, like such a backlash. So it's not exactly positive, but that's a small, tiny light in case that does happen.
Yeah, a glimpse. Wonderful. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for the audience and to our three brilliant panelists for joining us. We've really appreciated hearing your insights. And it's certainly given me lots to think about. So just to say thank you very much. And to thank you to everyone for joining. And we hope to see you at our next department event, which will be in November.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you all.